architects should treat artifacts as a living tool, not static deliverables. Always remember that enterprise architecture is about enabling alignment and informed decisions. It's not about producing documentation for its own sake.
You end up having several different teams building their own architectures that don't talk to each other.
And when we look at the architecture profession, the miscommunication that exists, often solely based on the fact that there is no shared language, no common vocabulary. And my advice for starting architects would be to focus on artifacts that enable action, not just completeness. If you really have hundreds of diagrams in your architecture repository, then either your organization is over 1,000 years old or you're over-documenting.
Welcome back to the EE Explained. We have talked about architecture from many angles: strategy, roles and responsibilities for the architecture team, the architecture domains. But there is one thing that brings all that together: how we visualize it. In the end of the day, enterprise architecture is about helping people see and understand how their organization works. And that's what this episode is all about: visualizing architecture. We will unpack how language, modeling, and the right visuals can turn complex structures into something that makes sense for everyone. From business leaders to technical teams, each have their own perspective. And of course, joining me again, Eric Jager. Good to have you back for another deep dive session, Eric.
Thank you, Owen. Again, my pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to delivering yet another insightful session.
Ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
So let's start with something that might sound simple, but it's one of the biggest challenges in the architecture, which is the language. If business and IT speak different languages, even the best designed strategy can fall apart. That's why having a common modeling language is so important. It creates a shared understanding. And of course, modeling isn't just about drawing. It's more into a communication language, if I can say that. It fosters collaboration and alignment between teams. So my question is, how can a common language and modeling reduce misunderstandings between business and IT?
Like you said, this has everything to do with actually speaking the same language. So it's about ensuring that we mean the same things. So for example, if I were to tell you that I'm thinking of a round piece of fruit, you might not immediately know that I was thinking about an apple. You might think that I meant an orange. Now, when business and IT work together, a lot of misunderstandings actually come from the fact that they use different terminology and ways of describing the same things. So a common language and a consistent modeling approach can actually help to bridge this gap. And I think that by agreeing on shared definitions, like what exactly is meant by, for example, customer or service, or even the round piece of fruit that I just used in the example, then both sides avoid talking past each other. And models also play a big role in this whole setting because they make these complex structures and processes easier to understand, because business strategies can sometimes feel too abstract for other teams, while technical designs are often far too detailed, for example, for business leaders. So having this visual model, such as a business capability map or a process diagram or whatever, this creates a shared view that both groups can actually grasp, especially when this shared language is used. And this shared language and modeling also improve traceability, because business goals can then be directly linked and related to the capabilities, to the process, the applications, technologies, etc., that support them. So it becomes actually clearer why certain initiatives matter and how they enable business strategy. And this makes decision-making more collaborative, and it reduces the risk of wasted investments. So I think that ultimately using a common language, a shared language, if you will, and a modeling approach lowers the chances of miscommunication, and it helps align priorities, and it creates a single reference point that everyone in the organization can use. And that way, instead of arguing over the interpretation, arguing over apples and oranges, people can actually focus on solving problems and delivering value.
Exactly, Eric. When everyone uses the same language, you remove the translation gaps that cause confusion. It's not about fancy diagrams. It's more about clarity. And that will bring us to the next topic, which is, What happens when that doesn't exist, the same language or the common language? In other words, what problems might arise when architecture teams don't use a standardized modeling approach?
I think that's a good question. And I believe that when architecture teams don't use this standardized modeling approach, then actually several problems tend to surface. So I think that one of the most common is miscommunication, like we just discussed. And if each team describes the capabilities, the processes or systems in their own way, then stakeholders may interpret the same concept differently, leading to conflicting expectations. So, for example, if one architect models a service that might be seen as processed by another, which then creates confusion about scope and ownership. And I think another issue is inconsistency. So without standard models, diagrams and documentation can vary wildly in style, in level of detail, in terminology. And this makes it hard for others to understand or even reuse the work, especially when projects span multiple teams or business units. So I think that over time, the lack of consistency fragments the architectural knowledge base and reduces the trust in the documentation that is available. But it also creates problems with the traceability that I was referring to earlier, because when different approaches are being used, then linking business goals to capabilities, to applications, etc., becomes difficult, if not impossible. And I think this lack of clear line of sight undermines the decision making, because business leaders cannot easily see how their investments support business priorities. And then, of course, there is the risk of the absence of standards, which can increase cost and risk. So teams may duplicate effort by modeling the same things in different ways. Or worse, they might design solutions that don't align with the organization-wide strategy. So in the long run, this leads to inefficiencies, integration problems, missed opportunities. So organizations then usually resolve the lack of standardization by adopting established frameworks or modeling languages that provide the missing structure, that provide this common vocabulary, and that provide the agreed upon practices. So a common choice is, for example, the TOGAF standard, which offers a methodology for developing and managing enterprise architecture. Now, TOGAF itself doesn't dictate a single modeling language, but it does recommend ways of structuring architectures so that teams can describe business, data application, and technology layers consistently. And alongside the TOGAF standard, many organizations adopt Archimate, which is a modeling language designed specifically for enterprise architectures. So Archimate provides a visual notation for representing strategies, business capabilities, applications, etc. in a unified way. And because it is standardized, an Archimate diagram produced by one architect can be easily understood by another without the need for extra explanation. So this then helps ensure that models are comparable across teams and projects and even organizations. So in practice, the combination of a framework like TOGAF and a modeling language like Archimate gives architecture teams both the process guidance on how to structure and manage their work and the representation standards on how to communicate their work. Now, some organizations also use business process model and notation, the BPMN, for process level detail, or UML, the Unified Modeling Language, for system level design. But these are then typically applied in specific contexts under a much broader umbrella.
It's so true. Miscommunication and misalignment between teams. You end up having several different teams building their own architectures that don't talk to each other. Everyone creates fancy diagrams, very nice catalogs, but I think it's not building a shared language or a shared understanding of design, not just creating more diagrams and documents. Do you have any comments about this?
I think it's true. It's one of the most common things that we see happening around us. And when we look at the architecture profession, the miscommunication that exists, often solely based on the fact that there is no shared language, no common vocabulary. I think that's a real issue. Every organization feels that they can use their own approach to communicate the architecture. And in the long run, I think this leads to more confusion than it does right.
I totally agree. And by now, I think you already have established an understanding why language and modeling and having a same language and a same vocabulary matter. This will bring us to the next point, which is how we actually visualize architecture. In your book, Getting Started with Enterprise Architecture, you described three main types of visuals: catalogs, matrices, and diagrams. And you explained that each one serve a unique purpose. Let's unpack that by walking us through what each of these represents and why all three are necessary in the architecture in general.
Yeah, absolutely. So these three structures are actually the core views that the enterprise architects use to describe an organization. Each one, a catalog, a matrix, and a diagram, then highlights the different aspects of the architecture. And of course, they work best when used in combination rather than in isolation. So a catalog is essentially this structured list of architecture building blocks. Now, it could be a catalog of business capabilities, of applications, data entities, technology components. And the point of a catalog is completeness and classification, as it makes sure that nothing is overlooked and provides a single source of truth for what exists. So, for example, an application catalog tells you exactly which applications are in use across the organization. A matrix then describes the relationships between elements in different catalogs. So it is a kind of table that shows, for instance, which business capabilities automate which applications, or which applications depend on which databases. So this is where dependencies and overlaps become visible. And without a matrix, you might know what systems you have, but you wouldn't know how they interact or where redundancies exist. Third, a diagram is a visual representation of catalogs and matrices combined. So it turns lists and tables into a picture that communicates structure, flows, interactions at a single glance. So diagrams are therefore essential for storytelling, as they allow stakeholders to see how everything fits together, which is often, of course, much easier to grasp visually than through a lot of rows and columns of data. So all three are necessary because they complement each other. So catalogs ensure coverage, matrices provide analytical depth by showing relationships, and diagrams communicate the big picture in an accessible way. So if you only had catalogs, you'd have this static list without context. If you only had matrices, you would see the relationships but not the overall architecture. And if you only had a diagram, you might miss details or overlook important elements. So together, they create this complete and reliable view of the organization.
That's a great way to explain it, Eric. And if I can recap it, so catalogs give us the what, matrices show the how things are connected together, and diagrams visualize the big picture for storytelling. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. You could phrase it like that. Yeah.
It's a very powerful and simple structure once you see it that way. But I know where a lot of people get stuck. They spend so much time documenting architecture work that they forget to architect. How do you recommend beginners balance between the creation of these artifacts without getting lost in documentation and losing sight of real purpose of architecture?
I think that's really an important point, what you just stated, as many starting architects fall into this trap of documenting everything, and they lose sight of the core purpose of enterprise architecture, which is, of course, to enable decisions and alignment, not to produce diagrams and tables. So the key is to focus on value-driven modeling. And before creating a catalog, matrix, or a diagram, you should ask, who will use this and what decisions will it support? So if a model doesn't help stakeholders make a choice or prioritize or understand the enterprise better, then it's probably not even worth the time. And I think this will help keep you from over-documenting. And this is actually what inspired me to develop the enterprise architecture implementation wheel in the first place. Instead of trying to capture every capability, every system, every relationship up front, begin with the areas that matter most. And typically this is where there is high complexity, high cost, or misalignment. So for example, business capabilities that directly support the most critical goals and link them to the key systems. And once that foundation is in place, you can expand the artifacts gradually. But it also helps to leverage templates and standards. And I think that using established standards like the Archimate or the Togo standard or even the A wheel, this gives you a reusable constructs and notation, which reduces then the mental load of deciding on how to represent everything from scratch. Similarly, catalogs, matrices, diagrams, they can often be generated from this central repository. So you aren't manually duplicating any work. Architects should treat artifacts as a living tool, not static deliverables. To keep them up to date, review them regularly with your stakeholders. And the moment that documentation becomes a one-way output rather than a conversation starter, then it really stops serving its purpose. So in short, the balance then comes from staying purpose-driven, staying iterative, staying standardized, collaborative. And my advice for starting architects would be to focus on artifacts that enable action, not just completeness.
I always say that the goal isn't to fill the repository with diagrams. It's to use those diagrams to tell a story or to drive decisions, even create clarity in some circumstances. Do you agree with this statement?
Exactly. One thing that I'm hearing a lot out there in the architecture community is that it's so hard to maintain our repository because of all the hundreds of diagrams that are in it. If you really have hundreds of diagrams in your architecture repository, then either your organization is over 1,000 years old or you're over-documenting. Because the architecture repository should contain building blocks in the form of catalogs, matrices, and diagrams. It shouldn't contain drawings of every solution that has ever been created. That's not the whole point of the architecture repository. And that's where a lot of people in organizations actually go wrong. So yeah, I agree with what you just said.
That's a perfect reminder for all the practitioners working in architecture, Eric. And that leads us naturally to our next topic. How we store, manage, and even evolve all of these information. So we have talked about how we model, how we visualize the architecture. Now let's talk a little bit about where it all lives in the repository. The architecture repository is often where architecture either thrives or dies. It's the home of the organization insights, even the models and references for all the architecture artifacts. And when it's done right, it becomes the living system, if I can say that, that grows with the organization across the years. So why is it essential for organizations to have a structured architecture repository in the first place?
Most importantly, an architecture repository is essential because it serves as this single source of truth for an organization, or for the organization's enterprise architecture at least. And without it, information about the business capabilities, the processes, the applications, etc., it all tends to be scattered across documents, spreadsheets, even mental models, making it very hard to find, making it inconsistent, and also making it very quickly become outdated. So having this repository ensures consistency and standardization. So when architects and business leaders and IT teams refer to the same repository and they use the same definitions and classifications and diagrams, that is essentially creating this shared language, which we talked about earlier. And this shared language reduces the miscommunication and it ensures that decisions are based on a common understanding of the organization. So a repository also improves traceability and impact analysis, as it allows organizations to map relationships between, and here we go again, the business capabilities, the processes, the applications, even the infrastructure. So if a system is changing or being decommissioned, then stakeholders can quickly see which processes or capabilities will be affected, reducing the risk and avoiding costly surprises. Furthermore, having a structured repository enables reuse and efficiency. The architects can reference existing components, standards, patterns even, instead of reinventing the proverbial wheel. And over time, this creates a far more coherent and integrated architecture, supporting scalability and even agility. So the repository turns enterprise architecture from this set of disconnected artifacts into an actual living, actionable resource that drives alignment, that reduces risk, and improves decision-making across the entire organization. And again, I'd like to point out that an architecture repository does not contain hundreds of diagrams of every solution that's ever been developed. You should focus on letting it contain reusable artifacts. So it contains building blocks that can be used to develop solutions, not the solutions themselves. It's very important to remember that.
That's very important, Eric. And if I can recap this, a structured architecture repository makes enterprise architecture work repeatable and discoverable to all the related stakeholders.
Yes, absolutely. It's all about the coherence between things, which is impossible if you're not using a repository as this living thing in your organization, living and value driven.
That's a very important point, because we need to discuss the difference between the repositories that scale well and those that turn into what you call document graveyards. So every architect knows that feeling when you have architecture repository full of documents and diagrams, but no one actually uses this. So can you walk us through the difference between both examples?
Yeah, and like I said earlier, this is a very common pitfall in enterprise architecture. Now, I think the difference between a repository that scales well and one that becomes this document graveyard, as you called it, it usually comes down to structure, governance, and usage practices. So a repository that scales well is organized, standardized, and actively being the keyword, maintained. So it uses consistent naming conventions, taxonomies, modeling standards, so that every artifact, a catalog, a matrix, diagram, is understandable and reusable. The relationships between elements are clearly defined, which allows stakeholders to trace dependencies, to perform impact analysis, and make informed decisions. So importantly, a scalable repository is living, like I just said. Artifacts are regularly reviewed, updated, and validated against real-world changes in the organizational landscape. And users know that the repository is reliable, so they can return to it as a tool rather than just a storage space. Now, by contrast, this document graveyard then typically emerges when a repository becomes passive, inconsistent, and also poorly governed. Artifacts are added once and then left to gather dust. So different teams might use their own modeling styles, their own terminology, levels of detail. So nothing is really reusable or comparable. And over time, outdated or contradictory information accumulates, and stakeholders lose their trust in the repository. And then it becomes easier to just ignore it than to consult it, which then defeats its purpose entirely. So the key differences between them and a scalable repository being structured, standardized, actively managed, as opposed to this document graveyard, which is ad hoc, consistent, connected, and eventually neglected. One drives alignment and informed decision-making, and the other creates confusion and wasted effort. And it has everything to do with the overall maturity of the organization and even the maturity of the architects that are practicing enterprise architecture.
So in short, the key difference is if you can see that stakeholders actually use it to make decisions, it will be a living one, and it will be the single source of truth. While it is only dealt with like a storage unit, it will be neglected.
That is true, yeah, because then there will be inconsistencies, etc. No one can read it because everyone that is using the repository is using their own kind of language, which is impossible to translate for the next architect. So, like I said, it's better to neglect than to use it.
100%. Thanks so much, Eric, for this clarification. It is really very important to differentiate between both items. And I would like to tackle one of the most important things that most of the starting enterprises and starting architecture practitioners fall into, which is maybe without access to a big enterprise architecture tools. What advice would you give to teams starting from scratch, especially without access to the big EE tools?
I think if you're starting enterprise architecture from scratch, without these expensive tools, it sometimes can actually be a blessing in disguise, I think, because it forces teams to focus on value and simplicity rather than the features that a tool brings with it. So first you start with purpose and not volume. Identify the most critical business objectives, capabilities or processes that need alignment, and then model only that directly supports decision making or that clarifies complexity, and avoid trying to capture everything at once. So start small and then iterate. Practical, pragmatic. Secondly, I think to leverage lightweight tools and standards. So even simple tools like a spreadsheet or a diagram in PowerPoint or even free modeling tools can work if you stick to consistent structures. And you can implement catalogs as tables, matrices as cross-tab sheets, and diagrams as flowcharts or simple architecture sketches. It's more important to be consistent and use clarity than focus on the features of a specific software tool. And third, you should focus on standardized terminology, simple modeling rules. So define the core entities of your organization, business capabilities, processes, applications, etc. Define their relationships. Make sure that everyone uses the same definitions, because this will prevent confusion and it will build this shared language. Now, in one of our earlier videos, I mentioned the creation of this enterprise meta model. And that is what I'm referring to here. And fourth, I think it's important to iterate and validate with your stakeholders. So don't create artifacts in isolation. Regularly review your catalogs, your matrices and diagrams with both the business and IT teams, because this will help to keep the models accurate, and it ensures that they are used in real decision making, and that will reinforce their value. And last but not least, like we mentioned before, treat your repository as this living thing, not a static thing. So even if it's just a folder of spreadsheets and diagrams, then maintain version control, track those updates, assign responsibilities, and over time the repository will grow organically. And then you can migrate to more advanced tools if needed. Always remember that enterprise architecture is about enabling alignment and informed decisions. It's not about producing documentation for its own sake. So it's very important to keep asking yourself, does this model help someone to make a better choice? And if the answer is no, that is not a priority.
Such a practical advice that most of us forget about it, Eric. Starting small, starting with what adds value and iterate from there. I think, yes, you're 100% correct that a repository should evolve with the practice, not the other way around. Because most of the people, organizations bring in the tool or they start creating the repository without knowing or understanding the value behind it.
Yeah, certainly sometimes organizations really focus on the features that a tool brings first before they have this clear idea of what they want or at least need from a repository. And should be the other way around. First think about what you need and what you want to achieve, then cut it into small bits, small pieces that are easily achievable and work from there. And let it grow from there, and then get to a tool that will help you mature even further.
That's such perfect note to close the episode, Eric, because when you get the repository right, you create the foundation for sustainable architecture work. So to wrap up our session, we have seen how architecture visuals from shared language to structured repositories create clarity, consistency, and communication across the whole organization with different teams, business and IT. It's part of the EA that turns ideas into something that you can actually see and use. Thank you so much, Eric, for walking us through this. I think this is one of the most practical episodes so far.
Yes, Omar. Well, like I said at the beginning, it's been my pleasure. The last few sessions, it was my pleasure during this session. And I'm also looking forward to everything that is to come.
Yes, thanks so much, Eric, for your time. See you next episode.